Frank Russo stares at the eviction notice on his Marina workshop door, wondering how he'll tell his daughter he can't help with her nursing school loans anymore. 3 years after losing his beloved wife Rose, the 60-year-old mechanic is barely hanging on, working alone at a crumbling marina that nobody visits. When a broken-down yacht arrives with engine trouble that has defeated 3 expert repair crews, Frank knows he should turn it away. The boat belongs to Marina Valdez, a wealthy shipping magnate who expects nothing from the aging mechanic. But Frank has been fixing impossible engines his whole life. He listens to the motor and hears something the experts missed. In just 1 hour, he gets it running again using nothing but scraps and 30 years of experience. When Marina asks what she owes him, Frank just shrugs and says he's glad to help. What happens next will restore your faith in human kindness. Will Marina's unexpected response change Frank's life forever? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Harbor Haven Marina as Frank Russo turned Rose's wedding ring around his finger, a habit he'd developed in the 3 years since she'd been gone. The simple gold band had grown loose on his weathered hand, but he couldn't bring himself to resize it, just as he couldn't bring himself to change most anything else about their life together. The eviction notice crinkled in his jacket pocket as he walked the familiar path from his cottage to the workshop. 30 days. That's all the time he had left before the bank would padlock the doors on everything he and Rose had built together. The Harbor Haven Marina had been their shared dream, purchased with their combined savings and a leap of faith back in 1987. Rose had handled the books while Frank worked magic on engines that other mechanics had given up for dead. "Morning, Frank," called old Pete from his weathered lawn chair positioned strategically between the fuel dock and the coffee pot. At 73, Pete Marchetti had been coming to Harbor Haven longer than Frank had owned it. His lobster boat, the Sophia's Pride, had been hauled for the winter, but Pete still showed up every morning like clockwork, armed with thermos, coffee, and an endless supply of stories about the good old days when the marina bustled with activity. "Morning, Pete." Frank's voice carried the rasp of a man who'd spent decades breathing salt air and engine fumes. "Quiet morning." "Too quiet, if you ask me." Pete's keen eyes studied Frank's face. "You look like hell, my friend. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Frank waved dismissively. The truth was, he'd been surviving on coffee and whatever Jenny could slip him at the diner when she thought he wasn't looking. Every dollar saved was a dollar he could send to Sarah for her nursing school expenses, though even that wasn't enough anymore. The workshop door groaned on its hinges as Frank pushed it open. The familiar smell of motor oil, salt air, and old wood enveloped him like a well-worn jacket. This space had been his sanctuary for 37 years, filled with tools that told the story of every repair, every late night spent coaxing life back into dying engines. Rose's photograph smiled at him from the workbench, surrounded by the precision tools she'd bought him for their 20th wedding anniversary. Anniversary tools, she'd called them, laughing at her own joke. "So you can keep fixing things for another 20 years. The irony wasn't lost on him now. Rose had been the one thing he couldn't fix. His cell phone buzzed against his hip. Sarah's name appeared on the cracked screen, and Frank felt his chest tighten. Their weekly calls had become exercises in mutual deceptions, she pretending nursing school wasn't crushing her with debt, him pretending the marina wasn't drowning in red ink. "Hey, sweetheart." He forced brightness into his voice. "Dad, hi. I was just thinking about you." Sarah's voice carried the particular exhaustion of someone juggling full-time school with part-time work. "How's the marina?" "Oh, you know, busy as always." The lie came easily now. "How are your classes? Still acing that pharmacology course?" "Trying to. Dad, I've been thinking maybe I should take a semester off, get a full-time job, help you with—" "Absolutely not." Frank's voice sharpened. "Your mother would haunt us both if you quit school. You're going to be the nurse she always knew you could be." "But Dad—" "No buts, Sarah. You focus on your studies. Your old man's tougher than he looks." After they hung up, Frank slumped onto his work stool and buried his face in his hands. Sarah didn't know about the eviction notice, didn't know he'd already borrowed against Rose's life insurance policy to cover her tuition last semester. She certainly didn't know he was surviving on Jenny's charity meals and Pete's worried check-ins. The Marina's glory days stretched back to when Harbour Haven served as a working port for the local fishing fleet. In those days, 40 boats called the Marina home, and Frank's workshop stayed busy from dawn to dusk. Rose would bring him sandwiches and sweet tea, staying to organize parts inventory while he worked. They'd talk about expansion plans, about the marine education center they wanted to build, about the legacy they'd leave behind. But the fishing industry had moved to deeper ports. Recreational boaters preferred marinas with better amenities, and Harbour Haven had slowly emptied. Now only 7 boats remained year-round, their owners more sentimental than practical. Frank did what work he could, winterizing engines, fixing pumps, patching hulls, but it wasn't enough to keep pace with rising property taxes and maintenance costs. The workshop itself told the story of gradual decline. Roof leaks had created rust stains on his tool cabinet. The overhead lift hadn't worked in 2 years. Half the fluorescent lights had burned out, and Frank couldn't afford to replace them. Yet somehow, in this deteriorating space, he continued to work miracles that left other mechanics scratching their heads. Frank Russo could fix a Swiss watch with a hammer and a prayer. Rose used to boast to anyone who'd listen. She wasn't far wrong. Frank had an intuitive understanding of mechanical systems that transcended formal training. He could diagnose problems by sound, by feel, by some indefinable sense that seemed almost supernatural to those who witnessed it. Local legend told of the time Frank had diagnosed a transmission problem in a yacht simply by watching how it moved through the water. Another story involved Frank fashioning a replacement part from a soup can and duct tape that outlasted the original manufacturer's component. Whether these tales were entirely accurate mattered less than what they represented. Frank Russo was the mechanic you called when everyone else had given up. But legends don't pay electric bills. Frank walked to the small window that overlooked the harbour. The view had been Rose's favourite part of the workshop. She'd stand right here during breaks, watching the boats come and go, planning their future expansions. The harbour looked different, now emptier, somehow smaller. Where once a dozen boats had bobbed at the docks, now only a few hardy souls kept their vessels in the water year-round. Jenny Castellano appeared at the workshop door, carrying a steaming mug and a paper bag. At 52, Jenny ran Sal's diner with the efficiency of a military operation and the heart of a worried mother. She'd been Rose's closest friend and had appointed herself Frank's unofficial guardian since the funeral. "Coffee and a blueberry muffin," she announced, setting both on his workbench. "And don't even think about arguing. Rose would box my ears if I let you waste away to nothing." "Jenny, you don't need to." "I don't need to, but I want to. Besides, these muffins were getting stale. Better they go to someone who'll appreciate them." Frank knew Jenny was lying. The muffin was still warm from the oven, but he accepted her kindness with the grace of a man who'd learned to let friends help when they insisted. "Any word on the Castellanos boat?" Jenny asked, nodding toward a small fishing boat that had been sitting on blocks for 6 weeks. "Waiting on a part. Should be in next week." Another small lie. Frank had ordered the part but hadn't paid for it yet. The supplier was being patient, but patience had limits. Jenny studied his face with the intensity of someone who'd raised 3 children and could spot deception from across a crowded room. "Frank Russo, what aren't you telling me?" Before Frank could deflect, the rumble of marine engines echoed across the harbour. Both Frank and Jenny turned toward the window to see a sleek yacht emerging from the morning fog like something from a dream. The vessel was perhaps 60 feet long, its white hull gleaming despite whatever troubles had brought it, limping toward Harbour Haven. "Now that's a sight," Jenny murmured. "Haven't seen anything that fancy in these waters for years." Frank watched the yacht's approach with professional interest. Something was clearly wrong. The boat's movement through the water suggested engine trouble, possibly serious engine trouble. As it drew closer, he could see people on deck. their body language suggesting frustration and concern. "Looks like you might have some work coming your way," Jenny observed. Frank nodded, already mentally cataloguing the tools he'd need and wondering what kind of problem could bring such an expensive yacht to his humble marina. He had no way of knowing that the boat limping toward his dock would change everything, not just for him, but for the grieving woman standing at its helm, searching for something she couldn't name in the salt-tinged morning air. The yacht's engines coughed and sputtered as it approached the dock, and Frank's trained ear immediately began analyzing the irregular rhythm. Whatever was wrong, it was serious enough to leave the boat's owner stranded. Frank cracked his knuckles and reached for his tool belt. Some jobs, he thought, were worth doing regardless of whether you could afford to do them. The yacht, Second Chance, drifted toward Harbour Haven's dock with the resigned grace of something beautiful slowly dying. Frank watched from his workshop window as the vessel's captain, a professional, by the look of his movements, struggled to maintain control with what appeared to be intermittent engine power. A woman stood at the bow, her posture rigid with the kind of controlled composure that spoke of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Frank could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the rail with white-knuckled determination. She wore navy slacks and a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than Frank made in a month, but there was something in her stance that suggested she'd earned every dollar through sheer force of will. "That's Marina Valdez," Jenny said quietly, appearing beside Frank at the window. "I recognize her from the business magazines. Shipping empire, started from nothing. Lost her boy in a sailing accident few years back." Frank nodded, his attention focused on the yacht's labored approach. The engines were firing unevenly, and he could hear the telltale signs of a hybrid system struggling to coordinate its electric and diesel components. Modern boats, he'd learned, were marvels of engineering when they worked properly and expensive nightmares when they didn't. Marina Valdez stepped onto the dock with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent a lifetime hiding vulnerability behind competence. She was perhaps 55, with silver threading through dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her face carried the kind of lines that spoke of difficult decisions made and consequences accepted. "Are you the mechanic?" she asked Frank directly, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Spanish was her first language. "Frank Russo. And yes, ma'am, I am. 3 crews have looked at this engine. 3 crews have told me it's unfixable without a complete overhaul that would cost more than the boat's worth." She gestured toward the yacht with the frustrated precision of someone accustomed to problems that money could solve. "They've all said the hybrid system is too complex, too integrated, too modern for conventional repair." Frank studied her face, seeing past the controlled exterior to the exhaustion underneath. "But you don't believe them?" "I don't accept defeat easily, Mr. Russo." Frank understood that sentiment. He'd built his reputation on refusing to accept defeat, on finding solutions where others saw only problems. "Mind if I take a look?" Marina's expression shifted slightly, revealing the first hint of hope Frank had seen since she'd arrived. "The last mechanic charged me $800 just to tell me it was hopeless. I don't charge for looking." As Frank stepped aboard the Second Chance, he felt the familiar shift in focus that came with approaching a new mechanical challenge. The yacht's deck was immaculate, its appointments speaking of both quality and care. But underneath the surface beauty, Frank sensed the frustration of a machine in distress. The engine compartment told a story of modern complexity. The hybrid system combined a traditional diesel engine with electric motors, computer-controlled fuel injection, and enough wiring to stock a small electronics store. Frank could see why other mechanics had thrown up their hands. The system required specialized diagnostic equipment that most shops didn't possess. But Frank had learned long ago that computers could lie, sensors could fail, and sometimes the most sophisticated systems broke down in surprisingly simple ways. He placed his ear against the engine block and listened. The diesel component sounded healthy enough, good compression, even firing. The problem lay in the integration between the electrical and mechanical systems. Frank ran his hands along the wiring harnesses, feeling for heat, vibration, loose connections. Marina watched from the hatchway, her presence both respectful and intense. The first crew spent 6 hours with computer diagnostics. The second crew wanted to replace the entire electrical system. The third crew suggested I sell it for scrap. Frank said nothing, his attention focused on a particular section of the engine bay where the main power coupling connected the diesel engine to the electric drive system. The coupling appeared intact, but something about its mounting bothered him. "Mr. Russo?" Marina's voice carried a note of concern. "Is everything all right?" Frank straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "When did this problem start?" "About 3 weeks ago. The boat was running perfectly, then suddenly it began losing power intermittently. Some days it runs fine for hours, other days it barely makes it out of the harbor." "Any recent work done? Modifications, repairs, maintenance?" Marina thought for a moment. "The boat was hauled for bottom painting about a month ago. Standard procedure, they do it every year." Frank nodded and returned to the engine bay. Boatyards had a habit of over-tightening things, and hybrid systems were particularly sensitive to vibration and alignment issues. He traced the mounting system for the electric motor coupling and found what he was looking for: a gasket that had been compressed beyond its tolerance, creating a slight misalignment that disrupted the system's delicate balance. The gasket itself was a specialized component, probably costing several $100s and requiring weeks to order. But Frank had spent 37 years learning that specialized didn't always mean irreplaceable. He climbed out of the engine bay and walked to his truck, returning with a piece of wetsuit material he'd salvaged from a diving gear repair. Using his pocket knife, he carefully cut and shaped the neoprene into a gasket that would restore the proper spacing and alignment. "Mr. Russo," Marina said carefully, "that looks like wetsuit material. It's got the right thickness and compression characteristics. Sometimes the simplest solutions work better than the expensive ones." Frank installed his improvised gasket with the patience of someone who understood that rushing mechanical work was a sure path to failure. He checked the alignment twice, ensured all connections were secure, then stood back. "Try starting her up." Marina moved to the helm with the cautious optimism of someone who'd been disappointed too many times. The engine turned over once, twice, then caught with a smooth rumble that had been absent for weeks. The hybrid system synchronized perfectly, electric motors humming in harmony with the diesel engine. "I'll be damned," Marina whispered, then caught herself. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean." "Don't apologize. I'd probably say something stronger if I'd been fighting this problem for 3 weeks." Marina ran the engine through its full range, watching in amazement as the yacht responded with the smooth power she remembered. The integration between diesel and electric components was seamless, the computer systems finally receiving the stable input they needed to function properly. "Mr. Russo, what do I owe you?" Frank was already putting away his tools, his mind already moving to the next problem on his list. "Nothing. Just glad to see a vessel find its way home." Marina stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry?" "No charge. Took maybe an hour. Used a scrap of material that would have ended up in the trash anyway." Frank shouldered his tool bag. "Besides, any boat owner who names their vessel Second Chance probably deserves one." For the first time since arriving, Marina's composed facade cracked slightly. Frank caught a glimpse of something deeper: grief, perhaps, or a longing for something lost. The moment passed quickly, but it left Frank with the impression that he'd touched on something significant. Marina reached into her blazer and pulled out an elegant business card. "Mr. Russo, I'd like to stay in touch. What you've done today." She paused, searching for words. "I've dealt with many mechanics, many repair shops. What you've done is extraordinary." Frank accepted the card politely, though he couldn't imagine what someone like Marina Valdez would want with a mechanic like him. The card was heavy stock, embossed with gold lettering. Marina Valdez, President and CEO, Valdez Shipping International. "I'll be in touch, Mr. Russo. Count on it." The second Chance pulled away from the dock with restored grace, its engines running in perfect harmony. Frank watched until it disappeared into the morning haze, then looked down at the business card in his hand. He had no way of knowing that Marina Valdez had spent the last 3 years searching for something she couldn't name, something that her wealth and success couldn't provide. He didn't know about Miguel, her son, who had dreamed of marine engineering before a sailing accident claimed his life. He couldn't have imagined that his simple act of mechanical kindness had touched something in Marina that had been dormant since her boy's death. Frank tucked the card into his shirt pocket and walked back toward his workshop, where the eviction notice waited in his jacket and reality pressed in from all sides. But for just a moment, he felt the old satisfaction that came from solving an impossible problem, the feeling that had drawn him to mechanical work in the first place. Some jobs, he thought again, were worth doing regardless of whether you could afford to do them. 3 days after Marina Valdez disappeared into the morning fog, Frank's world collapsed a little more. The letter from Sarah's nursing school arrived on a Tuesday, its official letterhead immediately recognizable as the kind that delivered bad news with bureaucratic efficiency. Frank opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, whether from his worsening arthritis or pure dread, he couldn't say. The words swam before his eyes at first, but gradually resolved into the kind of polite, devastating language that institutions use to crush dreams. Regret to inform you. Financial aid eligibility. Payment required by. Sarah had lost her scholarship. Some technicality about credit hours and academic standing that Frank didn't fully understand, but the bottom line was crystal clear. $8,000 due immediately, or Sarah would be suspended from the nursing program she'd worked so hard to enter. Frank sank onto his work stool and stared at the letter until the words blurred together. $8,000 might as well have been $8 million. The Marina's checking account held maybe $300, and that was earmarked for next month's insurance payment. His personal savings had been depleted long ago, sacrificed to keep both Sarah in school and the Marina afloat. The life insurance policy from Rose's death represented his only remaining asset of any value, but he'd already borrowed against it twice. Frank pulled out his phone and called the insurance company, knowing what he'd hear but needing to confirm his worst fears. "I'm sorry, Mr. Russo," the customer service representative said with practiced sympathy. "Based on your previous loans, you've reached the maximum borrowable amount against the policy. Any additional loans would require—" Frank hung up before she could finish explaining the additional requirements he couldn't meet. He sat in the quiet workshop, surrounded by tools that had served him faithfully for decades, but couldn't solve this particular problem. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, can we talk tonight? Something important to discuss." Frank's heart sank further. Sarah was too smart not to notice when tuition payments were late, too observant not to realize something was wrong. He'd managed to shield her from the worst of his financial troubles, but the facade was crumbling. An hour later, Frank found himself in the sterile office of Harbor First National Bank, hat literally in hand, waiting to speak with Joan Morrison, the loan officer who'd known him and Rose for 20 years. Joan's sympathetic smile when she saw him confirmed what Frank already knew: this would not go well. "Frank, it's good to see you," Joan said, though her tone suggested otherwise. "What can I do for you today?" Frank explained his situation with the straightforward honesty that had always served him well. Sarah's scholarship, the nursing school deadline, his need for $8,000 to keep his daughter's dreams alive. Joan listened with the patience of someone who'd heard similar stories too many times. When Frank finished, she pulled up his file on her computer and studied the screen with professional detachment. "Frank, I wish I could help. I really do, but your debt-to-income ratio is already beyond our lending guidelines. The Marina's revenue has been declining for 3 years, and without collateral. The Marina itself is collateral. The Marina is already mortgaged to its full assessed value. After the liens, there's no equity available for additional borrowing." Frank had known this was coming, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly still felt like a physical blow. What if I sold some equipment? Tools? The lift? Frank, Joan's voice carried the gentle firmness of someone delivering terminal news. Even if you liquidated everything in that workshop, it wouldn't generate enough to secure a loan of this size. I'm sorry. The drive back to Harbour Haven passed in a blur of coastal scenery that Frank barely noticed. 37 years of building something, of creating value with his hands and his knowledge, and it all amounted to nothing when his daughter needed him most. Back at the marina, old Pete took one look at Frank's face and poured a cup of coffee without being asked. Bank meeting didn't go well. Frank accepted the coffee gratefully. Pete had an uncanny ability to read situations without requiring explanations. Some problems can't be fixed with the right tools and enough patience. Maybe, but I've seen you work miracles before. This isn't an engine, Pete. This is $8,000 I don't have for a daughter who deserves better than a failure for a father. Pete's weathered face creased with concern. Frank Russo, I've known you for 15 years, and you're many things, but a failure isn't one of them. You've kept this marina running through good times and bad. You've helped every boat owner in this harbor at one time or another, most times for less than you should have charged. Helping people doesn't pay the bills. No, but it means something. Don't underestimate what that's worth. That evening, Frank sat in his cottage living room, staring at the phone and dreading the conversation he needed to have with Sarah. The cottage felt too quiet, too empty. Rose's presence had filled these rooms with warmth and laughter, and even 3 years later, Frank could feel the echoes of conversations that would never happen again. Sarah's face appeared on the video call screen, her expression serious. Even through the pixelated connection, Frank could see the worry in her eyes. "Dad, we need to talk about the tuition payment." Frank's heart sank. "Sarah, I know you've been struggling. I know the marina isn't doing well. I've been thinking, and I want to take a semester off, get a full-time job, help you get back on your feet." "Absolutely not." The words came out sharper than Frank intended. "Your mother would haunt us both if you quit school. You're going to be the nurse she always knew you could be." "But Dad, the scholarship." "I'll figure something out. I always do." Sarah studied his face through the camera with the intensity she'd inherited from Rose. "Dad, when Mom was sick, you told me that accepting help wasn't the same as giving up. Remember?" Frank remembered. He'd said those words to convince Sarah to let the neighbors help with meals and household chores during Rose's final months. The irony of having his own words thrown back at him wasn't lost on him. "This is different, sweetheart." "How is it different?" Frank couldn't answer that question honestly without admitting his own pride was keeping him from asking for help he desperately needed. He ended the call with promises he wasn't sure he could keep and assurances that rang hollow even to his own ears. Later that night, Frank walked out to the end of the marina's main dock, where the water lapped gently against the pilings and the harbor lights created dancing reflections on the dark surface. This had always been his thinking place, where he came to work through problems that seemed impossible. Rose's jewelry sat in his bedroom drawer, her engagement ring, the pearl necklace her grandmother had given her, the small diamond earrings Frank had bought for their 10th anniversary. Together, they might bring enough to cover Sarah's tuition, but selling them would feel like erasing the last physical connections to their life together. Frank pulled Marina Valdez's business card from his wallet and studied it in the lamplight. 3 days had passed since their encounter, and he wondered if her promise to be in touch had been nothing more than polite courtesy. People with business cards like this one probably said a lot of things they didn't mean. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor, illuminating Frank's weathered face as he made a decision he hoped he wouldn't regret. Some problems, he thought, required more than the right tools and enough patience. Sometimes they required swallowing your pride and asking for help from unexpected places. Frank tucked the business card back into his wallet and walked toward his cottage, where Rose's jewelry waited in the drawer, and morning would bring either solutions or the hardest conversation of his life with his daughter. 20 miles inland, Marina Valdez knelt beside a granite headstone that bore her son's name in simple block letters. Miguel Antonio Valdez, 1995, 2021, beloved son. Forever in our hearts. The brass compass she held had been Miguel's most treasured possession, a gift from his grandfather that had guided him through countless sailing adventures before the accident that took his life. "I met someone yesterday, Mijo," Marina whispered, her voice carrying the kind of tenderness she reserved for these private conversations. "A mechanic who fixed what 3 expert crews couldn't. He reminded me of you somehow, the way he listened to the engine, the way he cared more about solving the problem than getting paid." The morning fog rolled across the hillside cemetery, muffling the sounds of the distant highway and creating an intimate cocoon around Marina and her son's grave. She came here every few weeks, always bringing Miguel's compass, always searching for some sense of direction in a life that had lost its true north when the Coast Guard found his capsized sailboat. Miguel had been 26 when he died, full of dreams about marine engineering and sustainable boating technologies. He'd planned to work with his mother's shipping company, bringing innovative ideas to an industry that often resisted change. The irony wasn't lost on Marina that she now commanded a fleet of vessels while her son, who truly understood the soul of boats, was gone. "He didn't charge me anything," Marina continued, turning the compass in her hands. "Can you imagine, in today's world, someone who fixes the unfixable and asks for nothing in return? There has to be a reason our paths crossed, don't you think?" The compass needle swung gently, pointing true north with the unwavering certainty that Marina envied. Since Miguel's death, her own sense of direction had become muddled. The shipping empire she'd built through sheer determination felt increasingly hollow, a monument to ambition that no longer had meaning. Her therapist, Dr. Elena Reyes, had been encouraging Marina to find new sources of purpose, ways to honor Miguel's memory while moving forward with her own life. "Grief isn't something we get over," Dr. Reyes had explained during their most recent session. "It's something we learn to carry differently." That afternoon, Marina sat in Dr. Reyes's comfortable office, the compass resting on the small table between them. The therapist's gentle persistence had helped Marina navigate the worst of her grief, but today's session felt different somehow. "You seem more animated today," Dr. Reyes observed. "Something's changed." Marina found herself describing the encounter with Frank Russo in detail, his quiet competence, his refusal of payment, the way he'd listened to the engine as if it were speaking to him. As she talked, she realized how much the interaction had affected her. "What was it about this man that resonated with you?" "He reminded me that there are still people who do things because they're right, not because they're profitable. Miguel was like that, always more interested in solving problems than making money." Dr. Reyes leaned forward slightly. "Have you considered that this might be more than coincidence? Sometimes the universe puts people in our path when we need them most." Meanwhile, back at Harbor Haven, Frank's arthritis had flared with the changing weather, making even simple tasks painful. His hands, which had once possessed surgeon-like precision, now trembled when threading bolts or handling delicate components. The condition had been worsening gradually, but stress seemed to accelerate its progression. Old Pete found Frank in the workshop, struggling to remove a stubborn fuel filter from a client's outboard motor. The job should have taken minutes, but Frank's swollen knuckles couldn't maintain the grip necessary for the specialized tool. "Let me give you a hand with that," Pete offered, but Frank waved him off with characteristic stubbornness. "I can manage." "Course you can, but sometimes managing is easier with help." Frank finally accepted Pete's assistance, watching as the older man's steadier hands completed the task Frank had been fighting for 20 minutes. The defeat stung more than the arthritis pain. "Getting old's a son of a bitch," Pete said matter-of-factly, "but it beats the alternative." That evening, Frank made the decision he'd been dreading. Rose's jewelry box sat on their bedroom dresser, untouched since her funeral. Opening it felt like a violation of sacred space, but Sarah's future hung in the balance. The engagement ring caught the lamplight, its modest diamond sparkling with memories of a younger Frank proposing on this very harbour. Rose had cried when he'd slipped it onto her finger, not because of the ring's value, but because of what it represented, shared future built on love and hard work. The pearl necklace had belonged to Rose's grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of strong women. Rose had worn it to their wedding, to Sarah's high school graduation, to every important moment that required dignity and grace. Frank's hands shook as he lifted each piece, remembering the occasions when Rose had worn them, the way her face had lit up when he'd surprised her with the diamond earrings on their 10th anniversary. His phone rang, startling him from his reverie. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Frank quickly closed the jewelry box before answering. "Dad, I've been thinking about our conversation. I want you to know that whatever's going on, we'll figure it out together. Mom always said that Russos don't give up, and they don't face problems alone." Frank's throat tightened. "Sarah, I called the school today. They'll accept a partial payment to keep me enrolled while we work out the rest. I can take out a student loan for the remainder." "No, you're not going into debt because your father can't provide for his family." "Dad, listen to me. I'm 23 years old. I can make my own decisions about debt and education. What I can't do is watch you sacrifice everything for my dreams." After they hung up, Frank sat on the edge of his bed, Rose's jewelry box heavy in his hands. Through the window, he could see the harbour lights reflecting on the water, the same view that had comforted him and Rose through 36 years of marriage. A car pulled into the marina's gravel parking area, its headlights sweeping across the workshop before settling into a parking space. Frank checked his watch, nearly 9 o'clock. No one visited the marina this late, unless there was an emergency. Frank walked to his cottage window and peered out, recognizing the sleek lines of an expensive sedan. A woman emerged from the driver's seat, her silhouette familiar even in the dim light. Marina Valdez had returned. She stood beside her car for a long moment, looking out over the harbour, as if gathering courage for something difficult. Frank watched her pull something from her jacket, the compass, though he couldn't identify it from his distance, and hold it up to catch the moonlight. Whatever had brought Marina back to Harbour Haven at this hour, Frank sensed it was connected to more than engine repair. He grabbed his jacket and walked outside, his curiosity overriding his exhaustion. "Miss Valdez, is everything all right with the boat?" Marina turned, and even in the poor light, Frank could see something different in her expressione determination that hadn't been there during their first meeting. "Mr. Russo, I hope you don't mind the late hour. I've been doing some research, and I have a proposition for you, one that might be beneficial to us both." Frank's hand instinctively moved to his jacket pocket, where Sarah's scholarship letter waited alongside Marina's business card. Sometimes, he thought, the universe had a strange sense of timing. Frank led Marina into his workshop, switching on the overhead lights that cast harsh shadows across the cluttered space. In the stark fluorescent glare, the workshop's deteriorating condition was impossible to hide. Rust stains on the tool cabinets, water damage from roof leaks, equipment that belonged in a maritime museum rather than a working repair facility. Marina's eyes took in every detail without judgment, her businessman's mind cataloguing deficiencies while something deeper appreciated the care Frank had taken to maintain what he could. Despite the workshop's obvious age and decay, every tool had its place, every surface showed signs of meticulous cleaning, and the smell of honest work permeated the space. "Please, sit," Frank said, gesturing to a relatively clean work stool while he remained standing, hands clasped behind his back like a man preparing for bad news. Marina reached into her jacket and withdrew Miguel's compass, setting it gently on Frank's workbench between them. The brass caught the light, its worn surface speaking of years of faithful service. "This belonged to my son," she began, her voice carrying the careful control of someone sharing something precious. "Miguel was 26 when he died. Sailing accident 3 years ago. He was—" She paused, gathering herself. "He was planning to be a marine engineer. He loved boats the way you do, understood them as living things rather than just machines." Frank's weathered hands moved instinctively toward the compass, then stopped. "I'm sorry for your loss, ma'am. I can't imagine. He would have been fascinated by what you did yesterday. The way you listened to the engine, found a solution that bypassed all the expensive technology. That's exactly how Miguel approached problems." The workshop fell silent, except for the distant sound of water lapping against the dock pilings. Frank waited, sensing that Marina needed time to find her words. "I've spent the last 3 years trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life," Marina continued. "My shipping company runs itself now. I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But none of it means anything without Miguel to share it with, without someone to pass it on to." Frank understood that particular emptiness. He'd felt something similar since Rose's death, the hollow sensation of accumulating experiences with no one to share them with, of working toward goals that no longer had meaning. "Yesterday, when you fixed my engine and refused payment, you reminded me that there are still people in the world who do things because they're right, not because they're profitable." Miguel was like that. Marina stood and walked to the window that overlooked the harbor, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass. "I've been researching Harbor Haven, Mr. Russo. This marina has quite a history." Frank followed her gaze toward the water. "Built in 1950, by a man named Thomas Brennan. He wanted to create a place where working boats and pleasure craft could coexist, where knowledge got passed down from one generation to the next. And you've carried on that tradition for 37 years. Tried to. But traditions don't pay property taxes or keep roofs from leaking." Marina turned back to face him, and Frank saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Purpose, perhaps, or the beginning of a plan. What if they could? Before Frank could ask what she meant, the workshop door opened, and old Pete stuck his head inside. "Frank, sorry to interrupt, but..." He stopped when he saw Marina, his eyebrows rising slightly. "Oh, didn't realize you had company." "Pete Marchetti. Marina Valdez," Frank said, making introductions. "Pete's been coming to this marina longer than I've owned it." Pete's face lit up with recognition. "The lady with the fancy yacht. Frank here, get her running smooth for you." "Like new," Marina replied. "Mr. Marchetti, how long have you known Frank?" 15 years, give or take. Watched him work miracles on engines that other mechanics gave up for dead. Course, I also watched this place slowly empty out as the fishing industry moved to deeper ports." Marina's attention sharpened. The fishing industry was important to Harbor Haven. "Oh, absolutely. Back in the day, this place was home to maybe 40 working boats. Frank kept every one of them running, no matter how old or ornery they got. But economics change, and fishermen follow the money." After Pete left, Marina walked slowly around the workshop, her fingers trailing along workbenches that had supported decades of repairs. She paused at a wall where Frank had hung photographs, images of boats he'd worked on, crews he'd helped, moments of triumph when impossible problems yielded to patience and skill. "These pictures tell quite a story," she observed. Frank joined her at the photo wall, pointing to various images. "That's the Mary Catherine pulled her engine 3 times before we figured out she had a hairline crack in the block. This one's the second wind owner said she'd never run right, but turned out someone had installed the wrong propeller. And this one?" Frank's expression softened as he looked at a photo of himself and Rose standing beside a beautifully restored wooden sailboat. Rose was pregnant in the picture, her hand resting on her rounded belly, both of them grinning with the exhausted satisfaction of completing a massive project. "That's the Sarah's dream. Rose and I restored her from the keel up. Took us 3 years, working evenings and weekends. We named her after the daughter we were expecting." Marina studied the photograph with the intensity of someone memorizing details. "She's beautiful, the boat and the woman." Rose had this vision for what Harbor Haven could become, not just a marina, but a place where maritime traditions got preserved and passed on. She wanted to start an apprenticeship program, bring in young people who could learn the old ways alongside the new technologies. What happened to that vision? Frank's voice carried the weight of accumulated disappointments. Cancer happened. Medical bills, missed work, 3 years of fighting a battle we couldn't win. After Rose died, keeping the lights on became more important than chasing dreams. Marina picked up Miguel's compass from the workbench, watching its needle find true north with unwavering certainty. Mr. Russo, what if I told you that Rose's vision doesn't have to die with her? What if there was a way to honor both her memory and Miguel's? Frank studied Marina's face, seeing something there that made his pulse quicken. I'd say that sounds too good to be true. Sometimes the best things do. Marina closed the compass with a decisive snap. I have a proposition for you, but it's going to require trust on both our parts. Are you willing to listen? Frank looked around his workshop at the tools Rose had given him, at the photographs documenting a lifetime of honest work, at the space where they'd planned a future that cancer had stolen. Then he looked at Marina Valdez, a woman who'd lost her own dreams to tragedy, but seemed to be offering something he couldn't quite define. I'm listening, he said. Marina spread a rolled set of yellowed papers across Frank's workbench, weighing down the corners with spare bolts and washers. The documents looked official, covered in architectural symbols and engineering notations that spoke of ambitious dreams and careful planning. I found these in Rose's things, Frank said quietly, recognizing the papers immediately. She never told me she'd had architectural plans drawn up. The blueprints showed Harbor Haven Marina as it could be expanded docks, a modern but traditional-looking workshop building, classroom spaces, and what appeared to be a marine education center. Rose's handwritten notes filled the margins, detailing everything from equipment specifications to curriculum ideas for the apprenticeship program she'd envisioned. She was quite a planner, Marina observed, studying the detailed annotations. These plans are comprehensive and not just dreams, but actionable blueprints for transformation. Frank traced his finger along the proposed expansion, seeing Rose's vision laid out in precise detail. The main workshop would be 3 times its current size, with proper ventilation, modern lifts, and specialized bays for different types of repairs. Adjacent classrooms would allow for both theoretical instruction and hands-on learning. She spent months working on these, Frank said, his voice heavy with memory. Talked to architects, marine engineers, even education specialists. I thought it was just a fantasy, something to occupy her mind during slow periods. I never realized how serious she was. Marina pulled out her phone and began taking photographs of the blueprints, capturing every detail of Rose's carefully planned future. Mr. Russo, what if this wasn't just Rose's fantasy? What if it was a roadmap? Marina May, I call you Marina. This would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more. I can't even afford to fix my roof. But I can. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and implication. Frank straightened, his lifetime of independence warring with the desperate need that had been consuming him since Sarah's scholarship letter arrived. I don't accept charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a partnership. Marina moved to stand beside Frank, both of them looking down at Rose's blueprints. My son Miguel spent his last year researching dying maritime traditions, documenting skills that were disappearing as older craftsmen retired without passing on their knowledge. He was particularly interested in places like harbor haven-working marinas that represented the soul of American boat building. She paused at one of Rose's detailed sketches showing the proposed classroom layout. Miguel believed that hands-on learning was being lost in our digital age. He wanted to create programs that would preserve traditional marine craftsmanship while incorporating modern technologies. Frank found himself drawn into Rose's vision as Marina spoke, seeing possibilities he'd long ago dismissed as impossible. What exactly are you proposing? I want to fund the complete renovation of Harbor Haven according to Rose's plans, with some additions inspired by Miguel's research. In return, I want you to run a marine education program that would honor both their memories. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he rolled up the blueprints. The offer was everything he'd dreamed of during his darkest moments, but accepting help on this scale felt like admitting defeat. I don't know the first thing about running an education program, but you know everything about fixing what others consider unfixable. You understand boats in a way that can't be taught from textbooks, that knowledge needs to be preserved. Frank walked to the window, looking out at the harbor where a few boats bobbed at their moorings. In the distance, he could see the lights of more prosperous marinas, places with modern facilities and corporate backing. "What's in this for you, Marina? Really?" Marina joined him at the window, her reflection joining his in the dark glass. "Purpose. For 3 years, I've been going through the motions of living without understanding why. Yesterday, when you fixed my engine and refused payment, you reminded me that there's still good in the world worth supporting. And Miguel. Miguel's journals are full of sketches and ideas for programs exactly like this. He dreamed of working marinas where knowledge got passed down, where young people could learn to see boats as more than just machines. Funding Harbor Haven's renovation would be like completing his last project." Frank turned to face her directly. "What about Sarah, my daughter's tuition? Would be the first scholarship awarded by the Harbor Haven Marine Education Fund, full tuition, plus living expenses, plus a guaranteed internship at one of my shipping facilities after graduation." The offer was so comprehensive, so perfectly tailored to Frank's needs, that it felt almost surreal. Frank's pride battled with his desperate love for his daughter and his loyalty to Rose's memory. "I need time to think about this." "Of course, but Frank," Marina placed her hand gently on his arm, "sometimes accepting help isn't about weakness. Sometimes it's about recognizing that other people need to help as much as you need to be helped." After Marina left, Frank sat alone in his workshop with Rose's blueprints spread before him. He could almost see her sitting across from him, sketching additions and improvements, her eyes bright with the enthusiasm that had made him fall in love with her 38 years ago. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Dad, I talked to financial aid again. There might be options we haven't explored. Don't give up on me." Frank stared at the message until the screen went dark, then looked again at Rose's careful plans. The woman he'd loved had seen possibilities where he saw only problems, had imagined solutions where he saw only limitations. He walked outside and down to the end of the main dock, where the harbor lights created dancing reflections on the dark water. This was his thinking place, where he came to wrestle with decisions too big for the workshop's confines. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor in its eternal rhythm, and Frank thought about guidance systems, compasses that pointed true north, lighthouses that showed safe passage, people who appeared in your life exactly when you needed them most. Marina Valdez had returned to Harbor Haven with more than a business proposition. She'd brought hope, wrapped in architectural plans and tied with the memory of a son who dreamed of preserving maritime traditions. Frank had spent 3 years believing that dreams died with the dreamers, but perhaps he'd been wrong. Perhaps dreams were like boats, they could be repaired, restored, and set sailing again if you had the right tools and enough faith. Frank pulled out his phone and scrolled to Marina's number. Some decisions, he realized, were too important to make alone. Some offers were too generous to refuse out of pride. And sometimes, accepting help was the strongest thing a man could do. But first, he needed to have a conversation with Rose's photograph, to ask permission for changes that would transform everything they'd built together into something larger than either of them had imagined possible. Frank stood in his cottage bedroom, Rose's photograph in one hand and his phone in the other, preparing to call Marina with his decision. 3 days had passed since her proposition, 3 days of wrestling with pride and possibility. He'd finally concluded that accepting her offer was the only way to save Sarah's future and honor Rose's memory. As he reached for the phone, it rang. Marina's name appeared on the screen, and Frank felt a moment of cosmic synchronicity. They'd been thinking of each other at the exact same moment. "Marina, I was just about to call you. I've made my decision about—" "Frank, wait, before you say anything, I need to show you something. Something I discovered that changes everything. Can you meet me at the marina? I'm already here." Frank found Marina standing in his workshop, a worn leather journal open on his workbench. Her expression was intense, almost reverent, as she looked up at him. "Miguel's engineering journal," she explained, her voice tight with emotion. "I've been going through his things, preparing to donate them to the Maritime Museum. I found this tucked away in his desk drawer." Frank approached cautiously, sensing that whatever Marina had discovered was significant beyond casual interest. The journal fell open to a page covered in Miguel's neat handwriting, accompanied by detailed sketches and photographs. "Read this entry," Marina said, pointing to a specific date, July 15th, 2021, just 3 weeks before Miguel's death. Frank read aloud. "Today, I drove up the coast to research dying American marinas for my thesis project. Harbor Haven Marina represents everything I'm trying to preserve: authentic maritime culture, surviving against impossible odds. The owner, Frank Russo, is exactly the kind of craftsman whose knowledge needs to be documented and passed on. He's been there 37 years, learning from the generation before him and maintaining traditions that are disappearing everywhere else." Frank's voice caught as he continued reading. "I watched him work on a vintage Chris craft, restoring the engine with the kind of intuitive understanding that comes from decades of experience. This is what I want to do with my life: find places like Harbor Haven and help them thrive, not just survive. I'm planning to visit next month, maybe propose an internship or collaboration." Frank Russo represents everything that's still right about American craftsmanship. Frank set the journal down, his hands trembling slightly. "He knew about me? About Harbor Haven?" Marina nodded, tears gleaming in her eyes. "There are 23 pages about Harbor Haven in this journal. Photos, sketches, detailed notes about the marina's history and your reputation." Miguel had already researched renovation costs, identified funding sources, even contacted marine education organizations about potential partnerships. Frank flipped through the pages, seeing his marina through Miguel's eyes, not as a failing business, but as a treasure worth preserving. The young man had documented everything: the workshop's unique tool collection, the traditional repair techniques Frank still used, even interviews with old Pete about the marina's golden years. "Look at this page," Marina said, turning to a section titled, "Frank Russo, Master Marine Mechanic." Frank read silently, his amazement growing with each line. Miguel had written, "Frank Russo possesses an almost supernatural ability to diagnose engine problems through sound and intuition. I watched him identify a timing issue in a diesel engine simply by listening to its idle. When I asked how he knew, he said the engine was talking to him." This kind of knowledge can't be learned from textbooks. It comes from decades of hands-on experience and genuine love for the craft. "He planned to visit you," Marina said quietly. "The weekend he died, he was supposed to drive up here and introduce himself. He wanted to propose a collaboration, his business knowledge and education, combined with your practical expertise." Frank sank onto his work stool, overwhelmed by the revelation that Rose's death hadn't been the end of Harbor Haven's dreams, but somehow part of a larger plan that was only now becoming clear. "There's more," Marina said, turning to the journal's final entries. "Miguel had already identified me as a potential funding source for projects like this. He drafted a proposal for something he called the Miguel Valdez Maritime Heritage Foundation, designed to preserve working marinas and traditional boat-building skills." Frank read the proposal with growing amazement. Miguel had envisioned exactly what Marina was now, offering a partnership between established craftsmen and modern funding that would preserve maritime traditions while training new generations. "He never told you about any of this?" Marina shook her head. "Miguel was always full of big ideas. I thought this was just another college project, something he'd forget about after graduation. I had no idea he was serious enough to do this kind of detailed research." Frank walked to his photo wall and stared at the picture of himself and Rose beside the Sarah's dream. The coincidences were too numerous, too perfectly aligned to be random chance. "Marina, when you had engine trouble and came to Harbor Haven, was that really an accident?" Marina's expression grew thoughtful. "I'd been cruising aimlessly for hours, trying to clear my head after a particularly difficult day. When the engine started acting up, Harbor Haven was the closest marina. At the time, it felt like bad luck. Now, Now it feels like Miguel was guiding you here. They stood in comfortable silence, both processing the implications of Miguel's journal. Frank felt as if pieces of a cosmic puzzle were finally clicking into place. Rose's hidden plans, Miguel's research, Marina's unexpected arrival, even Sarah's scholarship crisis that had pushed Frank to the breaking point. "There's something else," Marina said, flipping to a page near the journal's end. Miguel had already started a scholarship fund. "Look." Frank read the entry dated just 2 days before Miguel's death. "Talked to Mum about establishing a scholarship fund for young people interested in marine trades. She seemed interested but distracted, probably thinks it's another of my impractical ideas. Need to put together a formal proposal that shows the business case for preserving traditional skills. Going to start with Harbour Haven as a pilot program." Frank's throat tightened as he realized that Sarah's scholarship wouldn't be charity, but the fulfillment of Miguel's last educational vision. "Frank, I need you to understand something. When I offered to fund Harbour Haven's renovation, I thought I was acting on impulse, trying to find some way to honor Miguel's memory. But now I see that Miguel had already planned this. We're not creating something new, we're completing something he started." Frank picked up Miguel's compass from the workbench, watching its needle find true north with the same unwavering certainty the young man had shown in his plans for Harbour Haven. "All those coincidences, your engine trouble, your arrival here, even Sarah's tuition crisis happening at exactly the right moment to make me desperate enough to consider your offer. Maybe they weren't coincidences at all." Frank thought about the conversation he'd planned to have with Rose's photograph, asking permission to accept Marina's help. Now he realized that permission had already been granted, not just by Rose, but by the young man whose dreams had somehow intersected with theirs across the boundary between life and death. Miguel's proposal mentions training programs for young mechanics, scholarship opportunities, even a maritime museum component. Frank said, still reading through the journal, "This isn't just about saving Harbour Haven, it's about creating something that could influence marine education across the country." Marina nodded. Miguel saw Harbour Haven as a prototype, a model that could be replicated at other working marinas. He believed that preserving these places was crucial to maintaining America's maritime heritage. Frank closed the journal and looked directly at Marina. "You asked me 3 days ago if I was willing to accept your partnership. Now I have a question for you. Are you ready to help me complete your son's last project?" Marina's answer came without hesitation. "I've been ready my whole life. I just didn't know it until now." As if summoned by their decision, Frank's phone rang. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and Frank answered with a lightness in his voice that had been absent for months. "Sarah, I have some incredible news to share with you, about your education, about the marina, about a young man named Miguel, who somehow knew exactly what we needed before we needed it." Frank looked at Marina and saw her own sense of wonder reflected in her expression. Sometimes, he thought, the most important journeys began not with planning but with faith. Faith that the people we love never really leave us, that their dreams can live on through the kindness of strangers, and that the best partnerships are forged not in boardrooms but in workshops where two grieving hearts discover they've been searching for the same thing all along. 2 weeks after discovering Miguel's journal, Harbour Haven Marina buzzed with an energy it hadn't seen in decades. Construction crews arrived at dawn, their vehicles creating a convoy of possibility stretching from the main road to the water's edge. Frank stood at his cottage window, coffee mug in hand, watching teams of workers unload equipment with the methodical efficiency of people who built dreams for a living. Marina had wasted no time once their partnership was official. Within days, she'd assembled a team of contractors, architects, and marine engineers who approached the renovation with the kind of respectful urgency usually reserved for historical restorations. They understood they weren't just upgrading a marina, they were preserving a piece of American maritime heritage. The first order of business had been emergency repairs to prevent further deterioration. Frank watched as crews installed temporary supports under his workshop roof, their careful movements suggesting they understood the space's significance. These weren't typical construction workers who viewed old buildings as obstacles to efficiency. Marina had chosen craftsmen who appreciated the difference between renovation and preservation. Mr. Russo, a young woman approached carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of hard hat that suggested engineering education rather than casual labor. I'm Emily Chen, project supervisor. We're ready to begin the temporary relocation of your tools and equipment. Frank had been dreading this moment, watching his workshop dismantled, even temporarily, felt like surrendering control of his life's work. But Emily's respectful tone and careful attention to detail helped ease his anxiety. We've prepared a temporary workshop space in the old bait shed, Emily continued. It's not ideal, but we've installed proper lighting and ventilation. You'll be able to continue working while we rebuild the main facility. Frank followed Emily to the temporary space, impressed despite himself by the crew's thoughtfulness. They'd created a functional workshop that honored his existing organization system while providing modern safety improvements. His most essential tools were arranged exactly as they'd been in the main workshop, and Rose's anniversary tool set occupied the place of honor on the central workbench. Old Pete appeared in the doorway, grinning like a man watching his favorite sports team win an unexpected championship. Frank, you've got to see what they're doing with the docks. These folks know their business. Frank walked to the waterfront where another crew was reinforcing the existing dock structure while preparing foundations for the expansion shown in Rose's blueprints. The workers moved with the precision of people who understood that marinas required engineering standards far beyond typical construction projects. The pilings need to withstand hurricane, force winds, and 30-year tidal cycles, explained Tom Rodriguez, the marine construction foreman. We're not just building docks, we're creating infrastructure that will serve boaters for generations. Frank appreciated Tom's understanding of long-term thinking. Too many modern projects prioritized short-term costs over generational durability. Watching these crews work reminded Frank of the craftsmen who'd built Harbor Haven in 1,952 people who measured success in decades rather than quarters. Marina arrived mid-morning, emerging from her sedan with the controlled energy of someone managing multiple complex projects simultaneously. She'd been splitting her time between Harbor Haven and her shipping empire, somehow maintaining both without compromising either. How are you handling all this? Frank asked as Marina surveyed the organized chaos of renovation. Honestly, I haven't felt this engaged in years. My shipping company runs itself at this point, but this project requires constant attention and creative problem-solving. It reminds me why I enjoyed building the business in the first place. They walked together through the construction zone, Marina stopping frequently to consult with supervisors and approve modifications. Frank was impressed by her hands-on management style. She understood the details without micromanaging, trusted her teams while maintaining ultimate accountability. We received the first applications for the scholarship program, Marina mentioned as they examined the foundation work for the new education center. 17 applications in the first week. Frank felt a surge of pride mixed with nervousness. The scholarship program, officially named the Russo Memorial Maritime Education Fund, represented the heart of their partnership. Sarah would be the first recipient, but Frank knew the program's success would be measured by its impact on future generations. Have you thought about curriculum development? Marina asked. Miguel's notes include detailed suggestions, but ultimately you'll be designing the educational program. Frank had been thinking about little else for 2 weeks. Teaching young people required different skills than repairing engines, and he worried about his ability to translate intuitive knowledge into structured lessons. I was hoping Sarah might help with that, Frank admitted. She's got her mother's gift for organization and communication. Maybe after she finishes nursing school, she could develop the formal curriculum while I handle the hands-on instruction. Marina's expression lit up. That's brilliant. Combining your practical expertise with Sarah's educational background would create exactly the kind of program Miguel envisioned. As they continued their tour, Frank noticed how naturally Marina fit into Harbor Haven's rhythm. She asked intelligent questions, listened carefully to workers' suggestions, and showed genuine interest in preserving the marina's authentic character. Her wealth hadn't insulated her from understanding real work. If anything, it seemed to have increased her appreciation for places where honest labor created lasting value. Jenny arrived at lunchtime with enough sandwiches to feed the entire construction crew. Her maternal instincts kicked into overdrive by the sight of hard-working people who needed feeding. Frank watched with amusement as she organized an impromptu buffet on sawhorses and plywood, transforming a construction site into a community gathering. "Frank Russo, you're looking 10 years younger," Jenny observed, handing him a turkey sandwich wrapped in wax paper. "Must be all this excitement agreeing with you." Frank had to admit Jenny was right. The constant activity, the sense of forward progress, and the knowledge that Sarah's future was secure had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for years. Even his arthritis seemed improved, possibly due to reduced stress, or maybe just the excitement of seeing Rose's dreams taking physical form. Sarah called that afternoon while Frank was reviewing architectural drawings with the construction team. Her voice carried an energy that matched his own renewed optimism. "Dad, I can't believe what's happening. My professors are talking about the scholarship program word is spreading through the maritime education community. They're saying Harbour Haven could become a model for hands-on learning programs. Are you ready for that kind of attention?" "Are you kidding? I've been bragging about my mechanic father my whole life. Now the rest of the world gets to see what I've always known, that you're brilliant at what you do." After hanging up, Frank found Marina standing at the edge of the construction zone, watching workers pour concrete for the education center's foundation. She held Miguel's compass in one hand, its brass surface reflecting the afternoon sunlight. "Miguel would have loved seeing this," she said quietly. "He always believed that preservation and progress could work together, that honoring the past was the best way to serve the future." Frank joined her, both of them watching the careful choreography of construction work. In a few months, this space would house classrooms where young people would learn the skills that Frank had acquired through decades of trial and error. The thought was both humbling and inspiring. "I've been thinking about the grand opening," Marina said. "Miguel's journal mentions wanting to invite marine educators from across the country to showcase Harbour Haven as a prototype for similar programs." Frank felt a flutter of nervousness. Public speaking had never been his strength, and the idea of presenting Harbour Haven to a national audience seemed overwhelming. "Don't worry," Marina said, reading his expression. "We'll do this together. You provide the expertise, I'll handle the presentation logistics." As the sun began setting over Harbour Haven, Frank walked through the construction site one more time, marveling at how quickly dreams could become reality when the right people committed to making them happen. Workers were cleaning up for the day, but the sense of momentum continued even in their absence. Frank paused at the spot where the new workshop would stand, its dimensions marked by surveyors' stakes and string lines. In 6 weeks, this space would house state-of-the-art equipment alongside traditional tools, creating an environment where ancient craftsmanship and modern technology could coexist. Rose's photograph smiled at him from the temporary workshop, surrounded by tools that had served him faithfully for decades. Soon those tools would occupy a purpose-built space designed specifically for teaching, for passing knowledge from one generation to the next. Frank thought about Miguel, the young man whose vision had somehow bridged the gap between loss and hope, between individual dreams and collective legacy. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, not just building a marina, but creating an institution that would honor the past while serving the future. The lighthouse beam swept across Harbour Haven as it had every night for decades, its steady pulse a reminder that some things endure regardless of the changes surrounding them. Frank smiled, knowing that soon Harbour Haven would join that ranks of enduring places that survive not because they resist change, but because they adapt while preserving what matters most. 6 weeks later, Frank stood before the gleaming new workshop doors, a brass key warm in his palm. The morning sun cast golden light across Harbour Haven's transformed landscape, revealing the full scope of what they'd accomplished together. Where once a deteriorating marina had struggled to survive, now stood a model of maritime education that would serve generations of future craftsmen. The workshop building retained the weathered cedar aesthetic of the original structure while housing thoroughly modern capabilities. Through the windows, Frank could see the state-of-the-art equipment. Marina's team had installed hydraulic lifts that could handle everything from dinghies to yacht engines, computerized diagnostic systems that interfaced seamlessly with traditional hand tools, and workbenches designed with ergonomic precision to accommodate both experienced mechanics and learning students. Marina appeared beside him, her own key gleaming in the morning light. The partnership agreement they'd signed made them co-owners of Harbour Haven, but more importantly, it made them co-guardians of Rose's and Miguel's shared vision. "Ready?" Marina asked, her voice carrying a mixture of excitement and reverence. Frank turned the key and pushed open the doors to reveal a space that took his breath away. The workshop stretched twice the length of the original building, its high ceilings supported by exposed beams that honored traditional boat-building aesthetics while providing modern functionality. Natural light poured through skylights designed to supplement rather than replace the warm glow of carefully positioned work lamps. Frank's original tools occupied the place of honor at the central workstation, Rose's anniversary set arranged with museum-quality care while remaining fully functional. New equipment surrounded the familiar pieces like respectful students gathering around a master craftsman, creating a seamless blend of old and new that Miguel would have appreciated. "My God," Frank whispered, running his hand along a workbench crafted from reclaimed teak that had once formed the deck of a historic sailing vessel. Even the workspace surfaces told stories of maritime heritage. Sarah emerged from the classroom section of the building, her nursing school graduation cap still slightly askew from the morning ceremony. She'd insisted on driving straight from her graduation to witness her father's first steps into the renovated workshop. "Dad, this is incredible. Look what they've done with Mom's education center design." Frank followed Sarah through a doorway marked Rose Russo Memorial Classroom and found himself in a space that perfectly captured Rose's vision for hands-on learning. Scale models of various engine types lined one wall, each one functional and designed for disassembly and study. Interactive displays showed cutaway views of marine systems, while traditional chalkboards waited for diagrams that would explain concepts too complex for digital representation. "The first class starts Monday," Marina said, joining them in the classroom. 12 students, ages 18 to 25, all selected based on aptitude and passion rather than previous experience. Frank felt a flutter of nervous excitement. Teaching young people represented a challenge unlike any engine problem he'd ever faced. These students would be looking to him not just for technical knowledge, but for guidance about building careers in a rapidly changing maritime industry. "I've been reviewing the applications," Sarah said, pulling out a folder thick with paperwork. "These kids come from all over the country. Some have never seen a boat engine before, but they all share something important. They want to work with their hands, to create and repair, rather than just consume." Frank flipped through the applications, impressed by the diversity of backgrounds and motivations. A former software engineer seeking more tangible work. A high school graduate from Iowa who'd fallen in love with boats during a summer job. A Coast Guard veteran looking to transition military skills into civilian maritime careers. Each application told a story of someone seeking the kind of purposeful work that had sustained Frank for 37 years. Miguel would have loved meeting these students, Marina observed. He believed that hands-on learning attracted people who wanted to make a real difference in the world. Frank walked to the window that overlooked the harbor, where the renovated docks now accommodated both working boats and visiting vessels with equal grace. The expansion had tripled Harbour Haven's capacity while maintaining the intimate character that made it special. Pleasure boaters moored alongside commercial fishing vessels, creating the kind of diverse maritime community that Rose had envisioned. The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the parking area, where cars and trucks were arriving for the afternoon's grand opening ceremony. Frank recognized several faces, old Pete, of course, and Jenny with what appeared to be enough food to feed a small army. But there were unfamiliar faces as well, people wearing the kind of serious expressions that suggested professional interest rather than casual curiosity. The marine education community is very excited about what you've created here, Marina explained, noting Frank's concerned expression. Representatives from vocational schools, maritime academies, even some traditional universities want to see how the Harbour Haven model might work at their institutions. Frank felt the weight of expectations settling on his shoulders. This was no longer just about saving his marina or honoring Rose's memory. Harbour Haven had become a proof of concept that could influence maritime education across the country. Sarah squeezed his arm reassuringly. "Dad, you've been teaching people your whole career. Every mechanic who's watched you work, every boat owner who's learned something from your explanations, you've always been an educator. Now you just have a proper classroom to do it in." Frank nodded, drawing strength from his daughter's confidence and the physical reality of Rose's dreams made manifest around him. The key in his hand represented more than access to a building. It was the key to a future where maritime traditions would survive and thrive in the hands of a new generation. As more vehicles arrived for the ceremony, Frank realized that the next few hours would determine whether Harbour Haven's transformation was truly complete or just beginning. The grand opening ceremony transformed Harbour Haven's waterfront into a celebration of maritime heritage and future possibility. Frank stood before a gathering of nearly 200 people, his weathered hands gripping the podium as he looked out at faces that represented the full spectrum of the boating community, from weathered fishermen to university professors, from teenage scholarship recipients to seasoned marine engineers. Marina stepped to the microphone first, her composure masking the emotion Frank knew she was feeling. "3 months ago, I arrived at Harbour Haven with a broken engine and a broken heart. I left with both repaired, and with something I didn't expect to find a purpose that honors my son's memory while serving something larger than myself." She gestured toward the gleaming new facilities behind them. The Harbour Haven Marine Education Center represents the partnership between traditional craftsmanship and modern innovation that my son Miguel envisioned. But more than that, it represents the generosity of a man who fixed my engine and asked for nothing in return. Frank felt his throat tighten as Marina continued. Frank Russo embodies everything that's still right about American craftsmanship skill earned through decades of experience, wisdom gained through solving impossible problems, and the generous spirit that shares knowledge freely with anyone willing to learn. When Marina introduced him, Frank stepped to the podium with the same careful deliberation he brought to complex repairs. The crowd fell silent, sensing that this man's words would carry the weight of authenticity. 40 years ago, my wife Rose and I bought this marina with more dreams than money, Frank began, his voice carrying across the water with surprising strength. Rose saw possibilities where I saw problems. She imagined young people learning alongside experienced craftsmen, traditional skills passing from one generation to the next. Frank paused, looking toward the spot where Rose's memorial garden now bloomed beside the education center. Rose didn't live to see these dreams become reality, but her vision guided every decision we made during this renovation. The classroom that bears her name will teach students not just how to fix engines, but how to approach problems with patience, creativity, and respect for the tools and traditions that came before them. He pulled Miguel's compass from his pocket, its brass surface catching the afternoon sunlight. This belonged to Miguel Valdez, a young man I never had the chance to meet, but who somehow knew exactly what Harbour Haven could become. Miguel's research and planning provided the roadmap we followed, proving that inspiration can transcend the boundaries between life and death. Frank's voice strengthened as he found his rhythm. The 12 students who'll begin classes Monday morning represent more than Harbour Haven's future. They represent the survival of skills that our maritime economy depends on. In an age of disposable everything, they're choosing to learn how to repair, restore, and preserve. He gestured toward the workshop where his original tools now stood alongside modern equipment. This program will teach students that there's no shame in working with your hands, no limitation in choosing craftsmanship over corporate climbing. The world needs people who can solve problems that computers can't diagnose, who can create with tools as well as keyboards. The crowd erupted in applause, but Frank raised his hand for continued attention. I want to introduce you to someone who embodies everything this program hopes to achieve. A young woman stepped forward from the group of scholarship recipients, Maria Santos, whose application had particularly impressed Frank. At 19, she'd already completed 2 years of community college while working nights to support her family, all while maintaining a fascination with marine engines that reminded Frank of his own younger self. Maria will be our first lead student, Frank announced. She'll help develop curriculum, mentor other students, and assist with the research projects that will keep Harbour Haven at the forefront of marine education. Maria approached the microphone with nervous confidence. 6 months ago, I was working at a gas station, dreaming about a career that didn't exist for people like me. Today, I'm standing in a workshop that looks like something from my wildest imagination, preparing to learn from a master craftsman who's forgotten more about engines than most people ever know. Her voice carried the passion that Frank recognized in all truly gifted mechanics. Mr. Russo has already taught me the most important lesson, that fixing things isn't just about technical skill, it's about patience, observation, and respect for the machine you're trying to help. This program isn't just training us to be mechanics, it's training us to be craftsmen. As Maria spoke, Frank noticed several university representatives taking notes, clearly impressed by the articulate passion of Harbour Haven's students. This was exactly what Miguel had envisioned, a program that would influence maritime education far beyond its own docks. The ceremony concluded with the presentation of official partnership documents, making Harbour Haven's transformation legally permanent. Frank and Marina signed the papers on a table made from the original Marina's first dock plank, symbolically connecting Harbour Haven's past with its future. As the crowd dispersed, many people approached Frank to discuss potential collaborations, visiting student programs, and consulting opportunities. The isolation that had nearly destroyed Harbour Haven was being replaced by connections that would sustain it indefinitely. Frank stood at the end of the main dock as evening approached, watching the last visitors depart while the lighthouse began its nightly ritual. The key to his new workshop felt warm in his pocket, symbolic of possibilities that stretched far beyond anything he'd imagined when Marina's yacht first limped into his harbour. Tomorrow, the real work would begin, teaching young people not just how to fix engines, but how to find purpose in honest craftsmanship. Frank smiled, knowing that Rose and Miguel would both approve of the legacy they'd helped create together. 6 months after Harbour Haven's grand opening, Frank stood in the doorway of the Russo Memorial Classroom, watching Maria Santos explain fuel injection principles to 3 younger students with the patient precision of a natural teacher. The workshop hummed with productive energy, the sound of learning happening at its most fundamental level. The Harbour Haven Marine Education Center had exceeded everyone's expectations. Applications for the second semester arrived from across the country, and 3 other marinas had already committed to establishing similar programs based on Miguel's research and Harbour Haven's proven model. What had begun as a desperate attempt to save one failing business had evolved into a movement that was reshaping maritime education. Sarah emerged from the administrative office that had become her domain since completing nursing school. She'd surprised everyone, including herself, by choosing to pursue a master's degree in educational administration rather than entering hospital work immediately. Harbour Haven had awakened in her the same passion for teaching that had driven Rose's original vision. "Dad, we just received confirmation from the National Maritime Heritage Foundation," Sarah announced, her excitement barely contained. "They're awarding Harbour Haven their Excellence in Preservation Education Prize. The ceremony is in Washington next month." Frank accepted the news with the measured satisfaction of someone who'd learned that recognition, while gratifying, was less important than the daily work of making a difference. "Will you be able to come with us?" "Try and stop me. Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't downplay your accomplishments when they interview you for the documentary." The documentary Sarah mentioned was part of a growing media attention that sometimes made Frank uncomfortable. Harbour Haven's success story had attracted interest from maritime publications, educational journals, and even a major television network planning a feature about innovative vocational programs. Frank tolerated the attention because it helped spread awareness of the program's mission, but he remained most comfortable in his workshop, teaching students the patient art of mechanical diagnosis. Marina appeared in the classroom doorway, her presence as natural at Harbour Haven now as it had been foreign 6 months ago. She split her time between the marina and her shipping empire, but Frank suspected Harbour Haven had become her true passion. The woman who'd once commanded corporate boardrooms now found equal satisfaction in helping teenage students understand the relationship between theory and practice. "Frank, there's someone here to see you," Marina said, her expression suggesting the visitor was significant. Frank followed Marina to the main office, where an elderly man in a worn baseball cap waited with the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to marine schedules. His weathered hands and keen eyes immediately marked him as a fellow craftsman. "Frank Russo. I'm Tom Bradley. Ran a marina up in Maine for 43 years before my arthritis forced me to sell. Heard about what you're doing here and drove down to see for myself." Frank shook Tom's hand, recognizing the firm grip of someone who'd spent decades working with tools. "What brings you to Harbour Haven?" "My grandson. Kid's got the same love for engines that I had at his age, but there aren't many places left that teach the old ways alongside the new. Was hoping you might have room for one more student." Frank smiled, remembering his own hunger to learn from experienced mechanics when he was young. "We always have room for someone who truly wants to learn. When can he start?" As Tom filled out enrollment paperwork for his grandson, Frank reflected on how Harbour Haven had become exactly what Rose had envisioned, a place where maritime knowledge flowed naturally between generations, where traditional skills merged seamlessly with modern technology, and where young people discovered the satisfaction of creating and repairing rather than merely consuming. That evening, Frank and Marina walked to the end of the main dock, where they'd developed a habit of reviewing the day's progress while watching the sunset paint the harbour in shades of gold and crimson. The lighthouse had begun its nightly rotation, its beams sweeping across water that now hosted twice as many boats as it had a year ago. "Miguel's compass," Marina said, holding up the brass instrument that had become their talisman. "I've been thinking about placing it in the memorial display, alongside Rose's tools and some of the students' first successful projects." Frank considered the idea, understanding Marina's desire to create a permanent tribute to their children's memory. "What do you think Miguel would prefer, a display case or active use?" Marina smiled, recognizing the deeper question. Miguel's compass had guided their partnership from the beginning, but perhaps its highest purpose was continuing to guide students toward their own true north. Active use, she decided. Miguel would want it helping people find their direction, not gathering dust behind glass. Frank nodded, thinking about the many ways people found direction in their lives. Rose had found hers in education and family. Miguel had found his in preserving maritime traditions. Marina had found hers in honoring her son's vision while building something lasting. Frank's own direction had evolved from simply surviving to actively shaping the future. The arthritis that had threatened to end his career had instead pushed him toward teaching, where his experience could multiply through the hands and minds of young craftsmen who would carry traditional skills into an uncertain future. Sarah joined them on the dock, carrying 3 cups of coffee and the satisfied expression of someone who'd found her calling. "I just finished reviewing applications for the fall semester. We're going to need to expand the dormitory facilities." "Good problems," Frank observed, accepting his coffee gratefully. As the lighthouse beams swept across Harbour Haven for the 1000th time since Frank had first stood on these docks as a young man full of dreams, he thought about the circular nature of legacy. Rose's vision had inspired Miguel's research, which had guided Marina's generosity, which had enabled Frank's teaching, which would influence countless students who would carry these values forward into careers and communities across the country. The eviction notice that had once represented his worst fears now hung framed in his office, not as a reminder of failure, but as a testament to how quickly desperate circumstances could transform into unexpected opportunities when the right people chose to help each other. Frank pulled Rose's wedding ring from his pocket, finally removed it from his finger the day of Harbour Haven's grand opening, but kept it close as a reminder of the love that had built the foundation for everything that followed. Tomorrow, he would place it in the memorial display alongside Miguel's compass, creating a shrine not to endings but to the eternal nature of dreams shared between people who understood that the best gifts we give are those that outlive us. The harbour lights reflected on the dark water as three people who had found each other through loss and purpose stood together, watching the lighthouse guide vessels safely home, while knowing that Harbour Haven itself had become a beacon for anyone seeking direction through the patient craft of working with their hands and the generous spirit of sharing knowledge, freely given.